be interesting, which may or may not be interesting to everyone. I'm going to do a very general discussion of the history of economic methodology, where it's been, where it is right now. I'm not going to say much about where it might be, but at least we can get some ideas about where it might be from the things that I'm talking about. Um, is my sound and video, is everything all right? Should I go?
Yes, okay. We don't have the presentation yet. I
Right,
don't know
right.
if
No,
you.
I know. I was getting
Okay.
ready for that. I wanted to make sure everything was set up. Okay, let's do this. And this. And do you have the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I can see me, I can see you, and I can see the presentation. So I'm moving on. Let me just start here with a quick outline of what I'm going to do, and then I'll move on. Oh, I did have one question before I start. Will there be questions at the end or not?
Yeah, at the end. At the end.
Okay, all right, all right. So I'm just going to blast very quickly through this outline. So I want to just say a couple words about economic methodology versus the philosophy of economics, since those two things get mixed up and I think will stay mixed up, but okay. And then I'm going to talk about sort of traditional focus of economic methodology, going back to, say, John Stuart Mill, um, and talk about 20th century economic methodology. Much of that is the foundation for the kinds of things that people are doing today, even though the things people are doing today are quite different. And then talk about changing character of economic methodology, say in the last 30 years or so. Um, Talk about how philosophy of science changes have changed economic methodology, how mainstream economics has changed. Talk about how the history of economic thought and methodology has changed in its relationship. And then a change in disciplinary affiliation. Philosophy of economics is not is is quite different in terms of what kinds of scholars are writing in it and the PhDs that the people have and all of that. And then I want to talk about some current topics. Now, there are hundreds of current topics that might be interesting. So instead of trying to do a smorgasbord of saying a little bit about everything that's going on, I'm just going to focus on some things where I've done some research. And along the way, I'll mention other things. But I want to talk about behavioral economics and its relationship to more traditional rational choice theory. I want to talk about something called the normative turn. And then I want to talk about behavioral welfare economics. So we'll go through the first part pretty quickly, and then hopefully in the question sections we can at the end we can talk a little bit about the future or possibilities of the future. So, all right, here we go. So I don't have anything for this slide. I just wanted to note that people talk about economic methodology and people talk about the philosophy of economics. And there's not a sharp distinction between those two fields. There was a sharp distinction much earlier, where philosophy of economics was more likely to include questions about economics and ethics or economics and ontology. It wasn't just philosophy of science applied to economics. But that has changed. Economic methodology has changed. Philosophy of economics has changed. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Nowadays, really, whether you're doing economic methodology or whether you're doing the philosophy of economics, has much to do with your audience and your background. In general, if you're a philosopher, you're doing philosophy of economics, and if you were trained as an economist, you're doing economic methodology. So given all that, I'm going to just I'm going to use whatever I want to use at the time, whatever feels right. So don't pay too much attention to the distinction. Um, so economic methodology versus philosophy of economics, as I said, I'm just going to assume they're sort of the same thing these days. That's not quite true. Um, so I'm going to start with this question of why did people start writing about economic methodology in the 19th century and the 20th century? I mean, what were they trying to achieve? What was the goal? What was the main focus? Now, I'm not talking about the details. I'm not talking about, whether someone was talking about economic methodology in neoclassical terms or in Marxist terms, or I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about sort of the grand sweep of why was anyone talking about economic methodology? And I think this, what I'm going to say here is true, but I don't think it gets enough attention. Um, Starting, let's say, with Mill and working all through the 20th century, um, the motivation was relatively the same. Whether the economics that they were talking about was classical or early neoclassical or mid neoclassical or something else, or their own particular position, right? The position on economic methodology of Robbins and Friedman and Samuelson were quite different. Even though there's all that difference, there was one common theme in all the literature. Now, I don't want to say all the literature. There's always special cases of people doing special things, but in general, the main focus was to explain how economics could be an empirical science like the natural sciences without being able to do controlled experiments. So if you think about the end of the 19th century in a sort of Newtonian world, you would expect a science to be an empirical science and an inductive science. And it was very difficult, if not impossible, to do controlled experiments in economics. Now we're doing them today. We're doing them today, but we're not doing them for most of the 20th century. And so that goal, how could economics possibly be a science, even though you can't do controlled experiments, really dominated the motivation for the field, which meant that economic methodology was not a critical endeavor generally. It was a supportive endeavor. It's an effort to show how economics could be a good science, even though it didn't have controlled experiments. And that crosses whatever science you're talking about. For John Stuart Mill, it was Ricardian economics. For Robbins, it was early neoclassical. For Friedman, it was something like mid 20th century Chicago price theory. So even though their economics was the economics they were targeting was quite different. There's a common theme. And since this is some people have trouble believing, let me give you some quotes. Okay. So here's John Stuart Mill in 1836. There's a property common to almost all of the moral sciences by which they are distinguished from many of the physical. That is, there is seldom in our power, that it is seldom in our power to make experiments. We cannot try forms of government and systems of national policy on a diminutive scale in our laboratories, shaping experiments, blah, blah, blah. So, John Stuart Mill has this line about if you want to look at a difference between two countries, you'd have to have two countries that were exactly the same except for one variable. And then you could see that one variable, see what effect it had. So moving on here, 100 years later with Robbins, same thing. It is equally clear the belief does not rest upon the results of controlled experiments. Later, Milton Friedman in the famous F53 essay. Unfortunately, we can seldom test particular predictions in the social sciences by experiments explicitly designed to eliminate what are judged to be the most important disturbing influences. So the kind of overarching motivation for economic methodology and philosophy of economics as well, but more methodology because this is mostly economists concerned with this. Is this trying to understand how economics could possibly be a science? And as I said, and two things are important about that. It was not initially a critical enterprise. Economic methodology was not developed to show what was wrong with economics. It was developed to show how it could possibly be right, or scientific at least. And then secondly, how this has changed. We do have controlled experiments now. So the original motivation for economic methodology is no longer with us, right? We have new issues, new concerns, and the field is quite different than it was even, when I started in terms of what people were trying to do. Okay. All right. So many faces of economic methodology: John Stuart Mill, Lionel Robbins, Milton Friedman, Karl Popper, as a philosopher, as you know, had a strong connection to economic methodology, partly because he was at LSE and was in touch with the Robbins group, but also there was a political economic connection. Popper wrote this book on the poverty hold on. Anyway, he Popper's political philosophy was in some ways sympathetic to the ideas of a lot of the economists around him. Kuhn had an important impact on the philosophy of economics, opening this question, and not himself, but economists using Kuhnian ideas opened this question about how does the history of economics relate to the philosophy of economics? Is the actual history what positivist philosophers would say scientific economics is? So this tension between history and philosophy. Lakatos played an important role in the development of the literature in the 1970s. As most of you know, a student of Popper, died young, and so there was a flurry of activity around his work, and then it died off fairly soon. Mark Blogg was both a historian and philosopher of economics, extremely influential in the development of INEM and the institutions of the philosophy of economics that we have now. In terms of late 20th century philosophers of economics that were actually philosophers, Dan Hausman and Alex Rosenberg, both of them wrote their PhD thesis in the 1970s in philosophy departments, and coming at that point in their career from a fairly positivist position, with Alex talking about laws in economics and Hausman talking about explanation in economics. And so anyway, these are the faces of economic methodology. Now, if you look at all these faces, you will notice something. First of all, they are all male. Secondly, they're all fundamentally either from North America or Northern Europe. So I have one slide here to emphasize the point that the philosophy of economics has changed not only in its topics and its focus, but it's also changed in terms of the individuals that are doing it. And to do that, I did a very quick snapshot at the INEM current officers, and they look like this. These are not the same faces we just saw. Half of these people are female. You have Emra from sorry, I'm spacing things here. It's still early in the morning here, but you have a number of people from a variety of different places. Turkey is what I was going for Emra. Some of you know Melissa. We have a South American representative. So the face of economic methodology, philosophy of economics, has changed radically. It's a lot more of an international thing. It's not an American thing and a British thing, which is mostly what it was for a very long period of time. We have a sea change in the discipline. So, okay, moving on to more theoretical content here. Changes in the philosophy of science. I'll go with these three pretty quickly. Philosophy of science in the 1950s and 1960s was predominantly logical empiricism, sort of second generation positivism. It was very much a this is the way you do science. It was a sort of rules-driven vision of the philosophy of science. This is what a good explanation is. This is what a good test is. This is what this is. Um, that was how philosophy of economics entered into it, sort of thinking about philosophy of science in these positivistic ways. Um, and that changed fairly quickly in the second half of the 20th century. Um, Philosophy of science is no longer armchair philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is much more naturalist. Instead of philosophers sitting around in in their closed world talking about what science ought to be. Philosophy of science is now much more naturalistic. You start with what scientists actually do, and then you try to understand what scientists actually do. It's not decrees from philosophers on what you must do. All of that spilled over into what philosophers of economics were thinking about and talking about. Um, Changes in mainstream economics. You probably know all of this stuff. There's certainly been a change. I mean, there's still neoclassical theory, and neoclassical theory is still a backdrop, and it's still what you learn in undergraduate. But we've had a change with behavioral economics. We've had an empirical turn. We have randomized controlled trials and all kinds of new empirical approaches to economics. This quote from Hollander, Colander, Holt, and Rosser is kicked around a lot, so you may have seen it, but it's a nice quote about this change. Economics is currently at a turning point. It's moving away from the strict adherence to the holy trinity of rationality, greed, and equilibrium to a more eclectic trinity of purposeful behavior, enlightened self-interest, and sustainability. Now, I'm not certain that that turn has completely transpired, as we'll see at the very end. There are some things going on in behavioral welfare economics that, in some sense, reinforce the old time religion of rational choice theory. But as a general spirit, this is certainly where things are going. Okay. So changes in the relationship between economic methodology and the history of thought. Um, I'll talk about this later. Economic methodology is now closer to philosophy um, than it was 40 years ago. Increased specialization within the history of economic thought. History of economics thought looks more like history now and less like economics. The history of economic thought has gone deeply archival, and consequently you end up with detailed, very, very detailed historical works, extremely interesting historical works, but works that are harder to pin a philosophical position on because they talk about institutions and they talk about politics and they talk about ethnicity and they talk about things that are hard to pin with a particular philosophical view. Um, what is the case is that almost every philosophy of economics paper these days uses some sort of case study or example, usually from modern economic thought. But they're pretty packaged for the purpose at hand, right? Historians of economics these days don't consider the kind of history that appears in 2 or 3 pages of a philosophy of economics paper to defend to provide support for the philosophical argument. Most historians don't consider that real history. So my point here is there's a spread between history and philosophy of economics, and in some sense, it's widening out. What you do as a historian is much removed in some sense from what you do as a philosopher, and vice versa. Although I'm not saying there's no connection, I'm just saying the connection isn't as tight as it once was. And then methodological grand history. Let's talk about the methodology of Keynesian economics or general equilibrium theory or monetary theory. Those kind of broad brush, wide sweep kinds of things. Seems to me, and you're certainly entitled to disagree with my interpretation of this, but it seems to me that that kind of broad sweep history is generally not considered to be very good history or very good philosophy of economics these days. So the stuff that I was doing when I was right out of graduate school, where you take Lakatos or you take Popper or you take Kuhn and you apply it to, say, Keynesian economics or neoclassical economics or something, that just is not what most people are doing. There's been a bit of a sea change. Now, I'm not saying no one does it. I was co-editor of the Journal of Economic Methodology for 15 years. We got a little bit of this, but it just is faded as the main theme or even the secondary theme within the literature. Changes in disciplinary affiliation. I think this should be important to the group, the people listening to this. There's been a substantial change in the disciplinary affiliation away from economics and toward philosophy. Some of it has to do with increased philosophical interest in biology. I know that sounds strange, but I'll explain it a bit here in a minute. And model-driven science without the philosophy of science. Some has to do with prices, incentives, and the fact that there's basically job opportunities in the philosophy of economics that are not in economics department. So this climate change thing has actually, I think, played an important role. Excuse me, I need my coffee. It's not just climate change, it's big modeling. I mean, if you're going to talk about climate change as a climate scientist, you're going to talk about things way out in the future and things that involve zillions and zillions of variables that interact in a wide variety of ways. And so if you're going to model that, it's not a model that you can test against the data in any straightforward or obvious way. And so what you have to do is you have to make a lot of assumptions if you're building a climate model, right? And those assumptions are fairly abstract. And yet, most educated people believe in climate science. Maybe not everybody in the street believes in climate science, but certainly the educated academics, scholars in general believe in climate science. And the question is, well, how can you have a science that's so abstract and has so many variables and is not directly testable, and yet it still be reliable? And a lot of philosophers of science in this field, in philosophy of biology and things like that, start to say, well, where do we find a field that has respect, at least respect within the members of the field believe in it, and it's used for public policy, and it seems to be moderately reliable, and yet all the models are very abstract and not directly tested, and so on and so forth. And guess what? That's economics. And so this interest in more complex models has moved philosophers of science to thinking about economics in a way that they didn't think about economics before. I mean, by and large, most philosophers of science in, say, the 1970s or 1980s weren't very interested in economics. Economics was just political economy. It wasn't real science. And now there's this connection. I'm probably spending too much time on this, but I think it's actually an important point, and it doesn't get much press. Um, so this is a quote from this Howman and Reese book on the recent book on the philosophy of economics. The sheer number and quality of contributions and contributors we see at conferences, journals, and book publications, and the proliferation of first-rate study programs are all testimony to the simple fact that the philosophy of economics is now a field in its own right. Philosophers of economics are everywhere. The leading academic programs and institutes in the field have grown. There are more of them too. Philosophy of economics has arrived. So there is a movement in the philosophy of economics. It is a very active field. I know the purposes of this conference is to get it accelerated in Latin America, but I want to stress that it is a different kind of field. It's primarily dominated by philosophers. It's not what was going on at the end of the 20th century in the field of economic methodology. There's some overlap, but it has created a lot of opportunities, particularly in the United States, which is where I have the most experience. It is utterly impossible to get a teaching position, to get an academic position as an economic methodologist in an economics department. Um, that's not necessarily the case in liberal arts colleges, but certainly in research institutions, it's the case. On the other hand, there are good jobs in philosophy departments in North America. And you can do the philosophy of economics. You may be doing the philosophy of social science with an emphasis on economics, but it is a field where there are jobs. And I don't know the situation in South America about that. I would suspect that it's moving in the same direction, but I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that later. Uh, okay, so some topics of current behavior, methodological interest. And like I said, this is not a list of all the interesting things that people are doing right now, or a list of all the things you might want to think about doing. It's really me talking about a couple areas that I have contributed to and am particularly interested in it. I would note before I start talking about these things that I've written about and I'm particularly interested in, uh, some of the other areas, just to throw out names of topics that are hot topics. And again, I got a lot of information about what the hot topics were, spending 15 years as the editor of GEM or co-editor of GEM. One area that has been much discussed in the last 10 years is this question about idealization and abstraction. So much of economics, particularly 20th century economics, general equilibrium theory, those kinds of things, were extremely mathematical and extremely abstract and seem to be far removed from any sort of accurate representation of the economy or testable or so on and so forth. And there's been a massive amount of literature in trying to understand how there can still be value in these mathematical models. There's a whole literature on how possibly models, right? Not how actually, but how possibly, and how you might learn something from a how possibly model. So that's one area that's a fairly busy area in the philosophy of economics. Another one is randomized controlled trials, primarily in development economics, but in other fields as well. Taking basically a medical model of experimental, gathering experimental information and applying it to economics. Now, there's a lot more, but that all I'm doing here is just mentioning a couple other areas of current interest that is not the one that I'm actually going to talk about, right? So anyway, behavioral economics has, as you all know, become a really big deal in economics. And how the economics profession has responded to it how mainstream economics has responded to behavioral economics has been a shifting locus. I mean, the original response in the 80s and 90s was pretty much disbelief. I mean, pretty much these people don't have any idea what they're talking about, blah, 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 blah. And then slowly over time, mainstream economics has embraced certain aspects of behavioral economics. And so this is a moving picture. This is an evolving relationship. When I'm talking about behavioral economics here, I'm talking about the early heuristics and biases program of Kahneman and Tversky, certainly the most established part of behavioral economics, but now starting to get a little age on it. This literature started with attempts to answer straightforward methodological questions about whether behavioral economics or rational choice theory is a better scientific theory of individual choice, but quickly expanded into other areas. So the original question was, if you want to understand human choice behavior, do you use rational choice theory? Do you use demand theory, right? Utility maximization subject to budget constraint? Or do you use behavioral economics? Do you use experimental approaches? And that was a methodological debate about the scientific value of behavioral economics as an explanation or prediction of individual behavior versus mainstream economics as an explanation or a prediction, a predictor of individual behavior, so on and so forth. That literature has died out. The methodological debates about behavioral economics do not, to me, again, maybe it's my own bias, but don't seem to be the main issue anymore. They've moved more to questions about normative economics. So I'm going to talk about three subsets of this methodological literature involving behavioral economics. I'm going to say something about rational choice versus behavioral economics. So that's the original question, right? I want to talk about something called the normative turn, and then talk about, in particular, behavioral welfare economics, and particularly the example of libertarian paternalism, which has had so much press and received so much attention, even outside of both economics and philosophy in the public policy domain. So I'll say a bit about each one of these three. Um, before before I start working on those, I have a nice quote here that I like that sort of sets the stage. So this is Dan McFadden, main Nobel Prize winning mainstream economist in 1999, right? So right at the beginning of the turn to the change. This research program has been the focus of Tversky and Kahneman on experimental study of cognitive anomalies, circumstances in which individuals exhibit surprising departures from rationality. And this is a great quote, I think. This work has both fascinated and dismayed economists. It has been like watching a master carpenter construct a scaffold for your hanging, right? So behavioral economics was in 1999 viewed as something that was attacking the mainstream and trying to substitute an empirical, experimental based way of approaching human behavior rather than the sort of top-down, let's assume a utility function, let's look at the implications of that and see what we can learn about behavior. These studies show that individuals faced with decision-making tasks and carefully constructed experimental set often exhibit behavior that is inconsistent with the Chicago man, his term, homo economist, rational choice, so on and so forth. So that, again, that's the setup going into this discussion of early discussion of behavioral versus rational choice. And there are a million questions, right? About testing, about explanation versus prediction, about internal validity, about aggregation, right? Traditional economics talks a lot about rational individual behavior, but it's really to get supply functions and demand functions. It's really to get market relationships, and behavioral economics doesn't automatically aggregate up to market relationships. It can, but these are questions to be addressed. About unification, can you unify the different parts of behavioral economics, and questions about whether you can unify behavioral economics and sort of neoclassical rational choice theory, about the causal mechanisms. You have this experiment and you see people do things. Well, why? Why do they do that? And on and on. The consensus within the methodological community has been that heuristics and biases should be taken seriously, but there's not a lot of consensus about these kinds of questions. But these kinds of questions are, in some sense, not the way that it's not the primary way that behavioral economics is being discussed in the methodological literature. It has moved in different areas. And one of those changes is something that's affectionately called the normative turn. Um, Economists have generally considered rational choice theory to be a scientific theory, maybe a bad one, but a scientific theory, a theory that predicts and explains individual behavior. On the other hand, normative questions, questions about what ought to be, have traditionally among economists and been associated with ethical questions. What's the right thing to do? How should we organize our society? Welfare, questions about welfare, questions about welfare, justice, and freedom. This connection has changed. Well, let me give you support for the previous quote. Friedman in 1955, science is science and ethics is ethics, but only confusion, discord and misunderstanding can come from not keeping the two separate. So there's this coming out of the second half of the 20th century, there was still this definite view that economics ought to be a science, and the normative might come with the application of economics, but normativity has to do with more social, more ethical kinds of questions, not scientific questions, right? Um, the the problem with that way of thinking about it is that normative doesn't necessarily equal ethics outside of economics, right? I mean, there's norms everywhere, right? They're action guiding, they're prescriptive, but they're not all ethical, right? And in particular, think about economic methodology. Think about the kind of economic methodology that Mark Blogg was doing. He criticized economists because they do not subject their economic theories to severe empirical test. He was a Popperian, right? So for Popper, good science is making bold conjectures and severe test. And Blogg was extremely critical of much of economics because it didn't do that, right? So, so, so that's a norm. He's criticizing economics from a norm. It's a norm, but it's not an ethical norm. It's an epistemological norm, right? So this idea that, that scientific method is positive and normative things are all ethical things, that is not viewed with the same kind of rigid demarcation as it was in earlier times. These things are getting blended, they're interdependent in various ways. Um, One way to interpret rational choice theory is to interpret it as a normative theory of rationality, a theory that describes what one ought to do in order to be rational. The relevant notion of rationality is quite specific, having well-defined goals and acting optimally on those goals, but the theory tells us what you ought to do in order to behave consistently with this rational norm. So you get this normative theory of rationality now has become, for a variety of reasons, a sort of it's now acceptable in economics to a degree, certainly, that it wasn't 30 years ago. And there's a lot of philosophical debate about this. Um, so this idea of normative rationality as opposed to normative morality, um, was, while most economists, most mainstream economists didn't think of rationality in normative terms in second half of the 20th century, let's say, or before. Certainly other fields did. I mean, a lot of philosophers, right? I mean, this is Nozick. An elaborate theory of rational decision has been developed by economists and statisticians and put to widespread use in theoretical and policy studies. It's a powerful, mathematically precise, tractable theory. Although its adequacy as a description of actual behavior has been widely questioned, it stands as the dominant view of conditions that a rational decision should satisfy. It's the dominant normative theory. So this is 1999 or 1993, but that certainly would have been an argument of decision theorists going way back, and philosophers of decision theory. And then, of course, normative behavioral economics. Behavioral economics has always taken this position, right? The position that what you're talking about, what you ought to do, is what you ought to do in order to be rational, right? The modern theory of decision making under risk emerged from logical analysis of games of chance. The theory was conceived as a normative model of idealized decision makers, not as a descriptive model of the behavior of real people. This is Kahneman and Tversky. We argue that deviations of actual behavior from the normative model are too widespread to be ignored, too systematic to be dismissed as random, and too fundamental to be accompanied by relaxing the normative system. So while most mainstream economists 30, 40 years ago didn't think of Homo economist as a normative issue, they thought of it as a positive theory. Certainly philosophers did, certainly decision theories did, theorists did, and certainly the first generation of behavioral economists coming out of psychology did. And this whole change has now moved into mainstream economics. You're much more likely to see the word normative applying to normative rationality and not other kinds of normativity. Which leads to what I call the normative retreat story, okay? So the evidence from, and I won't read this quote, let me just walk through this. So if behavioral economics is a positive scientific theory, it should be a theory that predicts and explains the behavior of individual agents, right? It's not about markets, right? It's not about class. It's not about economic development. It's about individual behavior, right? But it's a scientific theory, ostensibly, of individual behavior. Well, what behavioral economics demonstrated repeatedly from empirical evidence was that it's not a very good predictive or explanatory theory. That rational choice theory doesn't hold up when it's tested in empirical contexts, right? And so behavioral economics should be a serious challenge to Homo economists. It should be a serious challenge to thinking of economics as rational, optimizing individual behavior. But surprisingly, that's not been the case. Instead, the attention has now moved to the what is a normative turn, and a normative turn that can bolster rational choice theory rather than undermine it. Now, how is that? Well, what happens is if you make rationality not a descriptive thing or a scientific empirical thing, if you make rationality a normative thing, as something that you ought to do whether you do it or not, that all of a sudden, right, says, okay, right, that the fact is that individuals don't behave in the way rational choice theory says, but that's okay. It's not a problem because rational choice theory is a normative theory. It's not about what we do, it's about what we should do. And that changes the whole game. It changes the whole kind of relationship between behavioral economics and sort of standard mainstream economics. I'm looking at my clock here to see where I am. Okay. So, yeah, I will read this. The first response of economists was to challenge the empirical results of psychologists. But more recently, the response has been to reframe rational choice theory as a normative theory, as a theory of what people ought to do in order to be rational, rather than a descriptive theory of what real agents actually do when making decisions. On the surface, this seems to be a bit epistemically dubious. To start with a descriptive theory and then reframe it as a normative theory when the empirical evidence goes systematically against it. So and I don't have an answer to this. I'm not taking sides in this discussion, but this has become a very hot topic in the philosophy of economics, is this normative retreat. Is to what degree is rational choice theory something we want to support if it's only something people ought to do rather than something that people do, right? And so again, this now is contemporary philosophy of economics, and one of the many debates. Now, like I said, this is just one I'm particularly interested in. There are many others. So this is my last group of topics here. Um, so there's this reconciliation problem, right? For many decades in standard neoclassical theory, you had individual agents acting optimally, and those individual agents acted optimally, and you got to equilibrium. And at equilibrium, then welfare was associated with individual preference satisfaction. And in equilibrium, with everybody acting in their own rational self-interest, then everybody achieved the highest level of individual preference satisfaction. And so you got the welfare theorems in economics, first and second fundamental theorems of welfare economics. But behavioral economics drives a wedge in that. Behavioral economics says that what people do is not necessarily what's optimal for them. They don't maximize utility. They don't act like homo economists. And that drives a wedge between choice and welfare. And this is broadly called the reconciliation problem. That term was popularized by Sugden here in 2012. For at least 3/4 of a century, both descriptive and normative economics have been based on assumptions about individual rationality. However, there have been signs that economics might be changing. There has been an accumulation of work which tests rationality assumptions, often in controlled experiments, and finds systematic anomalies, deviations from the received theory. That's first generation behavioral economics. These developments pose severe problems for welfare economics. The problem of how to reconcile normative and welfare economics is the reconciliation problem, and it's only just beginning to be recognized. Nothing remotely like the consensus has been reached about how the problem can best be tackled. So this is, again, a really much debated topic in contemporary philosophy of economics. The term reconciliation problem I'm not saying no one ever used it before, but that term became popularized by Sugden et al., a paper in GEM in what was it? I'm sorry, 2016, something like that. So not very long ago. Could have been 2017, but okay. So again, you get an idea of where things are going. And then the final discussion here is to talk a little bit about libertarian paternalism, which is directly related to the normative turn and directly related to the reconciliation problem and all of that. So this notion, and I'm sure that everybody knows a little bit about libertarian paternalism. Maybe some of you have written on it, maybe you know a lot about it, but let me just give you a quick story. First introduced by Thaler and Sunstein in 2003. It starts from the behavioral economic argument that individuals make mistakes. They seek to find ways to, and then libertarian paternalism seeks to find ways to nudge individuals back toward more rational choices without using coercion or incentive-based models. So individuals are not acting rationally. We're going to nudge them back into acting rationally, but we're not going to use prices. We're not going to use the traditional neoclassical approach to that. And we're not going to use coercion, right? We're not going to put a gun at their head, and we're also not going to incentivize them. We're going to nudge them in other ways. And the way that gets done is to change the choice context, because one of the important things about behavioral economics is people change their choices when you change, if you take on a grocery store, if you move certain things to the front of the shelf and and other things to the back of the shelf, the exact same customer will change their behavior based on the choice context, the choice architecture, as it's called. It is argued that individuals' choice environment can often be changed in ways that nudge them into making more choices. Now, libertarian paternalism oftentimes gets applied to things like pollution or things like crime or things that are fundamentally social problems, externality problems. That's not the way libertarian paternalism started out. Libertarian paternalism started out as we're going to make these individual people better off because they better satisfy their preferences. We can nudge them into better satisfying their preferences. This is, yeah, okay. The changes in the choice architecture are designed so that individuals who are prone to heuristics and biases type mistakes will be nudged into more rational choices, while those who are not prone to such mistakes will not change their behavior as a result of nudging. Thaler and Sunstein have introduced popular terminology. So those that do not make mistakes are called econs, and those that do make mistakes are called humans. So this starts to, I don't know, I'm sure that each of you has a different attitude about mainstream economics, but this starts to take behavioral economics, which was seen as an alternative to mainstream rational choice theory, and it starts to turn it into something that looks like pretty strong support for rational choice theory. If you're going to say that welfare is associated with individual preference satisfaction, and if you're saying that these people are making choices that are not optimal, but you can nudge them into that, what you're really trying to do is to turn everybody into an econ. But ceteris paribus, that means that they'll have higher welfare. And so this is a twist. This is not just behavioral economics versus rational choice theory. This is quite a day change. So whether or not they have ever studied economics, many people at least implicitly committed to the idea of homo economist. The notion that each of us thinks and chooses unfailing wealth, so on and so forth. So this is behavioral economics moving in a direction that is, in some sense, repositioning mainstream economics, rational choice theory. Now, these are my last two slides, and I'm going very quickly because I'm running out of time. All I'm going to do is throw out some of the zillions of questions that this has raised, millions of philosophical issues. How do we know that nudging and shaping decisions only involves changing choices for given preferences and does not change preferences, right? How do we know we're nudging people into satisfying their preferences? Maybe we're nudging people, maybe we're changing preferences. So in some sense here, this is what I just said just a couple minutes ago. Some of behavioral economics sounded pretty radical and hostile to mainstream theory, but nudging is not hostile to mainstream theory, right? It's a normative role for rational choice theory. We're going to make everybody behave like econs, and they'll be better off, and we'll all live happily ever after. Nudging assumes the singular and universal supremacy of rational choice axioms as the proper normative benchmarks against which virtually all forms of behavior are to be measured. That's Berg and Gigerenzer in 2010. Behavioral economics challenges the positive validity of those axioms in describing human behavior. Nevertheless, behavioral paternalism maintains those axioms as a normative standard to which you ought to conform. So and this is my last slide. There's certainly an epistemic problem. If you're going to nudge someone into doing the right thing, and the right thing is satisfying their preferences, you have to know what their preferences is, and guess what? You're right back to the old problem of the measurability of utility that was 1920. How could a choice architect know him? And this I already referenced a bit. Libertarian paternalism is entirely about pro-self preferences and not pro-social preferences. And yet many of the examples are clear examples of nudging in the direction that is a social good, not necessarily what people may prefer. Now, as a matter of actual public policy, this may be a good thing in traditional standard approaches to externalities and public goods, but libertarian paternalism is not that. So when people are talking about, you know, libertarian paternalism is going to clean up the environment, that's not, I mean, there may be a way that it's a good policy. It may lead to positive social externalities, but the theory is not fundamentally oriented toward that. It's fundamentally oriented toward making sure that people, in fact, maximize utility in a well-behaved way. Autonomy problems, generally associated with moral and political philosophy. What does nudging say about freedom and power and liberal values and manipulation, so on and so forth? And then it's just fuzzy. There's all kinds of, there's better outcomes and all these different terminology that people use when they start talking about public policy issues and get away from sort of the main structure. So that looks like I am on time here. So I'll leave this. I'll leave this to people asking questions. I am done with the presentation. So thank you. Hopefully this was helpful, useful, something. And I'll get rid of the, let me get rid of the sharing. Okay. Okay.
We have people here at the room and people online, so we're going to organize the questions. We're going to give room to 2 questions here, presentially, and then 2 questions online. So if you're online, write at the chat, and I'm going to give you the word after. So here, and people here can closer because we're using this mic. Esteban?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question, if you let me, that goes back to the traditional distinction between normative and positive economics. So considering this, the strategy of libertarian paternalism, does this mean that we kind of acknowledge a dependence of positive economics being based on normative economics, in the sense that for the nudging we need policies?
Yes, but the way that I characterize this, and by the way, this is, I think, fair to say it's not a majority view, even within the philosophy of economics. But I think of normativity as always having some sort of referent. So normativity has to do with what you ought to do. Well, what you ought to do to be healthy, what you ought to do to be a good citizen, what you ought to do to be rational, what you ought to do to be. So it depends on the nature of the ought. And so what happens in the literature is you kind of get focused in on 2 oughts. One ought is you ought to be rational, and the other one is you ought to be moral. I mean, this goes back to Bentham, right? I mean, and so while there's an interdependency of the normative and the positive. While in some sense positive economics is influenced by normative, when you start to realize that there's a lot of different notions of normativity floating around, and you also recognize that the word rational means many different things. Rational for Aristotle is not rational choice theory in modern terms. So yes, there is an interdependency, but you can't, it's very hard unless you're talking about a very specific theory. And I think libertarian paternalism is one such theory, but unless you have a very tight definition of what rational means and a very tight definition of what ought to means, then you can talk about the relationship and make sense of it. But oftentimes you've got too many different oughts going on and too many different rationals going on to be able to say much. You can say they're interdependent, they're intertwined, they coexist, but you don't get very much kind of sort of solid arguments out of it unless you home in on a particular area, a particular field of economics, a particular theory, and then a particular notion of normativity. Then you can start to talk about how they actually interact. Is that fair or useful?
Yeah, a lot, but I was thinking that rather than an interdependence, it seems that for that particular argument, the paternalist, libertarian paternalist argument, it's more that the positivity of the empirical aspect of rationality depends more on how we make policies rather than the other way around. Than the idea that policies, I don't know, that policies should depend on the positivity, on the
So
empirical aspect.
yeah, I'm not entirely clear. Maybe I don't know whether this will help or not. Like I noted before, there's a whole lot of discussion of libertarian paternalism in public policy, and oftentimes it's just public policy. It's questions about fairness or justice or pollution or something else. Um, and libertarian paternalism, as it was originally set up, is not a very good tool for talking about that, because libertarian paternalism is paternalism. Paternalism. Paternalism is not a social thing. Paternalism is helping a particular individual, right? And so there's this mix of, when people start talking about libertarian paternalist policies, they're usually doing multiple things. Something that's a number of things that are social, that involve externalities of various sorts, and values about fairness and justice and so on and so forth, and all that. But at the same time, you're trying to get these individuals to behave in a way where they're more rational and better satisfy their preferences. And that thing is hard to sort out. So you get this, as I said, I don't know. It's hard for me to say which is the leader and which is the follower, or which comes first and which comes second. To me, they're often intertwined and difficult to separate.
Thank you.
Okay.
Somebody else here? I have a very little question. Is about when you said that many historians doesn't regard the word, this historical cases used by philosophers as real history. Do you have some example of methodology of philosophy economics done with case that could be regarded by historians like a good case of history? What kind of mixture
Well,
between history?
I don't want to pick on the work of my friends and colleagues, but one of the examples that shows up so much in the recent philosophy of economics um, is this idea of trying to would be the segregation model, Thomas Schelling's racial segregation model. And this shows up a lot in uh, philosophy of economics in various ways as an example of an example of an economic theory, and then people pull it all out. Um, and the thing is that there are so many different interpretations of this model. And it's not an economic model in the traditional sense, right? It doesn't have maximizing agents and all of that. It's just the opposite. So you have these case studies that play important roles in the philosophy of economics, and philosophers debate them back and forth and back and forth. And yet there's multiple interpretations of the theory, and the theory may not even be what most economists would consider to be economic theory, right? So that's part of it. But it is. Let me just give you a personal example of the issue of these examples. In the 3 years prior to COVID, for 3 years, I spent a month in the Tint Institute in Helsinki, Uskalimaki's Research Institute. And it was a fantastic experience for me. It's a wonderful center. I mean, you've got like more than 10 relatively young scholars working on philosophy of economics. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I love being there. But by and large, no one ever wanted to talk to me about philosophy of economics or economic methodology or anything like that. What they wanted me to do, they wanted to give me their paper and philosophy of economics paper, and then see if I could find examples that would support the argument in the paper. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're looking at the philosophy of physics, right? You have a theory, you have some comment, some argument about the philosophy of physics, you're going to go to a particular field of physics that exhibits that phenomenon that you want to talk about. So there's nothing wrong with this. So I participate in this. I do this. I write this. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these case studies. What I'm saying is, if you go to Duke and you go talk to deep historians of economics, they're going to say these are cheap little historical episodes that really don't say anything because they're not serious history. That's my point. My point is not that there's something wrong with them. My point is simply that that they're used for a particular purpose, and it's not like reading it's not like reading Bruce Caldwell's book on Hayek, right? It's not that kind of history. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have two questions online, Jose Edwards and then Felipe Núñez. Jose,
Okay.
are you there? By the way, Jose, make me the contact with you and
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't trust Jose's questions.
Yeah, so I have two of these. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So they will be related. The first one will be more clear than the second one, which will be a mess. But the first one, you've been talking in all your talk, you were talking of economics as science, right? And of the philosophy of economics, of the philosophy of economic science. And then you were also making the distinction, so separating the history of economics from economic methodology. And so this is like a kind of comment more than a question, is that So there are some, in my opinion, small parts of economics that really approach science, the experimentalist stuff, or the super abstract theory making activities of some academic economists. But of course, you have a much bigger part of what economists do, which is the policy part or professional activities of economics that have nothing to do or have little to do with science, really, right? So is there in the philosophy of economics, methodology of economics, really, so are these people really neglecting all these other parts of economics? Because the philosophy of economics could be the philosophy of economics as a humanity, or the philosophy of economics as, philosophy, like the worldly philosopher kind of view of things, or the philosophy of political economy, as Valras and all that. Not only the pure part, but also the applied part, the social part, and so on and so forth. So that's the first comment question. So what about the other 2/3 of economics, the applied part, the social part, not the science part? So are there interesting things? I'm sure there are, for philosophers of economics, economic methodologies to deal with, which are not just these economic science part. So that's one.
Okay. Can I respond to that first?
Mm, yeah, better, because if not, it will
Yeah,
be
because I mean, just responding to that could be hours. Okay.
yeah.
Um, so first of all, where am I coming from? I mean, I started with this discussion of what economic methodology was historically, and it was to validate economics as a science. I mean, whether it's John Stuart Mill or whether it's Milton Friedman or whatever. Um, and then you move into the end of the 20th century and you start to get using various philosophical positions within the philosophy of science, from Popper to Lakatos to whatever, in order to validate it or invalidate it, so on and so forth. Um, that whole vision rest on the belief that there is something called science that is clearly a thing quite different than poetry or music or whatever. And I don't believe that philosophers of science believe that anymore. And there may be a difference between poetry and science, but there's a lot of differences within science. Science is not a single thing, it's a diverse thing. And so when you are talking about this little body of science in economics, it's experimental, and then all this other stuff that's something else, it's not science. To me, and this is really weird, me talking to you as saying you're old fashioned, but to me, that's almost an old fashioned positivist view, right? I mean, one of the things that's going on in the philosophy of economics right now is to say, we're not here to prove that this particular economic theory is the secret, like science, it's real science, it's let's look at other knowledge aspects. Let's look at understanding. Let's look at breadth, depth, unification. Let's look at all these other things that go on in science other than this it's just this one thing that's empirical and we prove things. And so I think that the philosophy of economics has expanded the definition. Philosophy of science has expanded the definition of what science is, and it brings in, to some degree, sociology of knowledge and science studies and so on and so forth. So my first response would be that that you can talk about characteristics of scientific knowledge without having this sort of black and white, either is science or isn't, this demarcationist kind of view. Going in a different direction, certainly philosophy of economics nowadays, there's also a whole lot of literature on things like ontology. There's also a lot of literature on traditional ethics. And so philosophy of economics is not just focused on science, even if you broaden the definition of science. It also includes a lot of philosophic ideas that percolate through economics in a variety of ways that are fundamentally at a distance from the scientific part, even if the scientific part has many aspects. Is that you? I have a little picture and I can't tell whether you're frowning or anyway. So, second question or not?
Yeah, but then okay, so I agree what you say about. I guess my question was more into the point. So there is a lot written about how scientific the scientific part of economics is, how economists should do to make good economic science, but there is perhaps less written by philosophers of economics about how economists could do good economic policy, or how economists could, you see what I mean? Is this part of the philosophy of economics which would I don't know, prescribe, if you want, good ways of doing, this other part of economics? I was going in that sense, like do you think there's, enough written? Because I feel there's not, well, I'm not a specialist economic methodologist or philosopher, so I just don't know. So it was a question about, would you say the philosophy of economic science part, it's overrepresented or it's overdone, in comparison to the philosophy of economics in its to speak like that, I don't, you said black and white stuff, but well, you know what I mean, not the strictly scientific.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot more going on in the philosophy of economics other than the philosophy of economic science, even if you define economic science in a fairly pluralistic way. There's a whole literature on ontology. Ethics has come back in. I mean, philosophy of ethics is an extremely active field now. Positivism almost crushed it in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's coming back into economics. But all of that, if you're talking about philosophy of economics, you can talk about ontology of economics, you can talk about ethics in economics, you can talk about a lot of things other than epistemic applications. But that still is a separate issue to me, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that disagree with this, but to me, that's a different thing than an application. To me, when you talk about policy, policy is policy and theory is theory to me. And to me, there's a lot more diversity of philosophical ideas percolating around in the philosophy of economics now than there used to be. But that still is not the same thing as talking about instrumental application, talking about policy, talking about those kinds of things, more practical things. Those are important topics, but I'm not sure that's the philosophy of economics. I mean, to me, that's policy science or public affairs or political science or something. But that's my view. There's a lot of people who would disagree with that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt this very interesting discussion, and would like to kill you a lot, but we have a bit schedule here, and we are a bit off. So
okay.
I don't know if you can say a final words. Maybe there were more questions, but we have to launch
keep
here.
my second and very important one for later. I will.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can go ahead, Lucas.
Okay, so we thank Professor Hans again, and we're very pleased with your talking, with the discussion that was here. And people ask about the slides because they found it very useful for that. I don't know if you then want to give that, and we can upload in internet. But again, thank you very much. Maybe you can have a proper breakfast now. We can lunch.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say it was enjoyable. I hope people got some value out of this. I tried to make it broad ranging and all of that. And I certainly have the best wishes for the movement in the philosophy of economics in South America. I hope this all goes well. I hope you have conferences every year. I look forward to coming to physically instead of remotely. So anyway, if anybody has questions, concerns, I'm not a social media guy, so you know, getting me on TikTok or something's not going to work, but I'm always available for, you can always ask questions or comments or want suggestions for literature or whatever, just email me. It's an old-fashioned technology, but it still works. So, okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, the people online, and we see you. We hope presentially in the future.
Okay. All right. Thanks.